Donald Trump has released his national NSS national security strategy, and looking at the document, what is different from what we had from the Biden administration in terms of what's going on in Ukraine? We know what's going on in the Middle East, in the West Asia, with the case of Venezuela, with the case of China, India. The whole issue, how do you see the changes in the new document? Is there any substantial change in the new document? If so, what is that?
Good question. Substantial changes? Not really. I would put it, is there any substantial difference between the way this document expresses policy and strategy and what Trump has proven he's doing? Remember back when we began looking at the Trump administration back in January, February, we emphasized the strategy maker, Elbridge Colby at the Pentagon, and his partners in coming up with the idea that the US should trim its military capabilities to where it's most effective, withdraw from the Ukraine war and let the Europeans fight it if necessary, or achieve some form of peace that preserves the Ukraine, preserves the Europeans, and enriches the United States. The Colbridge strategy is this national security, and I'm looking down at the paper, national security strategy of the United States. Colby is the author of this. On the other hand, it's a political document, it's a political ad for Trump. And you get all of this hyperbole, the hyperbole of the hegemon that wants to be recognized, and I'm quoting it, as the greatest and most successful nation in history. That's Trump for you. Now, what you see in the document is a definition of strategy, which has been Colby's at the Pentagon. What you see is what's called sorting and prioritizing conflict and commitment of resources to meet US needs. Those include the Golden Dome, a seriously destabilizing factor in mutual nuclear assured destruction. The MAD strategy that you don't develop and can't develop a capability to attack a nuclear power and get away with it without facing their retaliation. The Golden Dome's in there, bringing the hand of the nuclear clock, the doomsday clock, closer to midnight, as Paul Craig Roberts said on your program a few hours back. That hand is still there so long as the Golden Dome is there. There's not much on nuclear strategy, but the Golden Dome's endorsed. And that's a mad attempt to establish nuclear dominance by Trump. There's, compared to the Biden period, yes, the Trump administration's got rid of USAID funding for all sorts of soft power, but in this, an influence building and subversion and propaganda everywhere. This document endorses the same thing using different methods. Same commitment to what's called, I'm quoting, unrivaled soft power. It wants unrivaled soft power. So did Biden. There hasn't been a presidential administration in the United States that didn't want unrivaled soft power, because it wants they've all wanted unrivaled hard power. And there's no shortage of the commitment to this in this document. There's a particular problem that this document makes clear. It will not allow, the US will not allow a regional actor to become dominant in that region against the United States. Well, what does that mean? It means support for Israel to go on destroying and threatening Iran and seeking regime change in Iran. It means the destruction of the Arabs as a unified group the destruction of Syria we've just seen. It means in the Western Hemisphere the destruction or crippling of countries that oppose the United States, obviously for the time being Venezuela, but potentially Brazil and other countries too. And I find in this document the commitment to preventing in Venezuela and elsewhere so-called hostile foreign ownership of assets. What's that mean? That means the US wants to supplant in Venezuela, for example, Russian and Chinese mineral and oil field ownership. If that's not an attempt to take over Venezuela, I don't know what is. It's the Western Hemisphere strategy of this document is even more to create banana republics subject to the United States than the Biden administration. So on Russia, there are a couple of points that are ambiguous. And so many commentators, let's call them the realists on the Ukraine war, see some reason for optimism. And I'm flipping over my pages so I can find the exact words. What we have in this document is a preoccupation with Europe. It gets 49 mentions. Then China, 21 mentions. Russia gets only 10 mentions, followed by Israel 6, Japan 5, India 4, Australia 3, Canada 2. Now, pardon me, about Russia, the only reason to be hopeful or even to see this as different from what's happened in the past, and I'm looking down to read it properly, is that there's a commitment to strategic stability between Europe and Russia and the preservation of the Ukraine as a viable state. I'm using the language of the document. And then you find a utterly perverse language. I'll read it out to you. The Ukraine war has had the perverse effect of increasing Europe's, especially Germany's, external dependencies. Today, German chemical companies are building some of the world's largest processing plants in China using Russian gas that they cannot obtain at home. Excuse me, what does that mean? The Biden administration participated in the destruction of Nord Stream, and the Trump administration, or Trump on his own signature here, and Colby at the Pentagon, think that was a good idea, but now they don't like the idea that the Germans have moved to China to take the Russian gas there. I mean, what a collection of lunatics who don't learn from their strategic mistakes. So, summing it up, I don't see very much reason for believing that this national security document is anything but an advertisement for all the lunacies that Trump and his men, including Colby, including Rubio at the National Security Council, are utterly committed to without respect for or without any change of sentiment towards their adversary, Russia, India, and China.
John, when it comes to Ukraine, do you think that I think one of the main changes was the case of Ukraine, that the Trump administration doesn't see any viability for the United States to stay there in Ukraine. They want to put all the burden on Europeans.
Yes.
How do you find the whole concept of, instead of having some sort of talks with Europeans, I don't know how good is this administration in communicating with Europeans, because so far we haven't seen that much of communication. We've seen Europeans going to Washington, sitting in front of Donald Trump in his office. That wasn't a a promising picture, coming out of Washington. And right now, there is some sort of division between the United States and Europeans in Ukraine. whose fault is that? How much of what's going on is depends on what Europe is doing, and how much is related to the policies of the Trump administration and the attitude they have?
Maybe we shouldn't try to say whose fault it is, because the combination of U.S. and European goals in fighting Russia on the Ukraine battlefield have contradictions, and they have common goals. Basically, and we've said it many times before, Trump can never afford to lose a war, not the way the war was lost in Vietnam, not the way the war was lost in Kabul by the Biden administration. Win, win, win is this man's doctrine, and he thinks, both personally and politically, that he will suffer seriously if he's perceived to lose the war in the Ukraine. He wants, therefore, to cover his retreat. In a no-win situation, he walks away. If the Europeans are prepared to buy from the US and pay the US for the armaments they supply to the Ukraine and go on fighting, and if that fight doesn't result in a rout, in a Russian-imposed defeat, armistice, capitulation, Trump's happy. Trump's quite happy. That's a stable outcome. The problem is that Trump has very short attention span. Will walk away from any non-win situation. The Europeans, he correctly says in the national security document, are weak minority political combinations. Merz has political mandate from the last election of less than 28% of German voters. He can go on fighting a war with Russia by repressing German opposition to that view. But he's a weak politician, desperately trying to keep fighting a war because the prospect of losing that war is more imminently the destruction of Merz's government and coalition. The same can be said of the Macron trying to rule France with a popularity rating of something less, somewhere between 10% and 15% public approval, no support, or very little, unstable minority support in the Assemblée Nationale, the parliament. Macron rules by war making through executive decree. And it's a very weak position politically and domestically. He too can't afford to lose this war. Trump understands this. The Americans understand this too. The same with Starmer, who wins a landslide election, is now trailing the Reform Party of Nigel Farage. Were there to be another election, and there won't be for a while, Starmer would be annihilated. So each of these is weak in minority political terms and cannot bear the prospect of a major change on the battlefield that amounts to defeat and capitulation. That would be the end of everything they've stood for. It would also destroy their commitment, their political commitment to remilitarization, armaments, and the constituencies that support them for that. So I think the Americans understand that's an unstable coalition of the weak, that if they can continue to fight, Trump will support them. But if they continue to lose under Russian pressure, Trump will drop them. Now, look, Trump is such a short-term win-loser calculation. He has essentially lost interest in the negotiations for peace since he sent Witkoff and Kushner to Moscow Tuesday a week ago, December 2nd. It's obvious when Trump was asked for the next 24 hours what had happened in this supposedly key negotiation for 5 hours with President Putin. Trump said he didn't know. I can read you what he said. I don't know what the Kremlin is doing, Trump said on December 3. I can tell you that they had a reasonably good meeting with President Putin. We're going to find out. That's what he said immediately. But he goes on. This week, on Monday, he was asked the same question. What's happening to the negotiations? Trump said, it's Vladimir Zelensky who doesn't know what's going on. Quotes, we've been speaking to President Putin, says Trump. He hasn't been speaking. He's been speaking through Witkoff. And we've been speaking to Ukrainian leaders, including Zelensky. And I have to say, I'm a little bit disappointed that President Zelensky hasn't yet read the proposal. That was as of a few hours ago. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia's fine with it. Russia, I guess, would rather have the whole country, wouldn't you think? But Russia is, I believe, fine with it, but I'm not sure Zelensky's fine with it. That's what Trump said on Monday. The man simply doesn't know what the term sheet was. He doesn't know what Zelensky says about the term sheet. He isn't following the negotiations. But what I tell you he is doing is he and Kushner are closely monitoring a $100 billion attempt at taking over Warner Brothers Discovery, a major Hollywood film company, from a group of Kushner allies. Paramount, which is a Larry Ellison business, Kushner himself through Affinity Partners, and Kushner's Middle Eastern friends, the Saudi Sovereign Fund, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Fund, and the Qatari Sovereign Fund. What Trump is doing here is focusing very clearly on a hostile takeover of Warner Brothers by his son-in-law. And just because Warner Brothers rejected the Kushner mob, I better emphasize they're a mob, Trump said yesterday he may veto the deal because it potentially threatens monopoly in certain media. The level of attention Trump and Kushner are paying to a multi-billion-dollar media business far exceeds anything either of them are paying attention to in ending the war in the Ukraine. Now, you can read all about the term sheets for the Warner Brothers, Netflix, Paramount, and Kushner deal in the financial press. You can't read anything like the clarity of term sheets in Trump's, the Ukrainian, the European accounts of reaching peace in a war in Europe. So, summing up, what am I trying to say here? Trump's in retreat from anything he can't show he's winning.